On August 15, 1971, millions of Americans sat down to watch their favorite Sunday night show, and instead, they got Richard Nixon. He went on live television to tell the country he was suspending, temporarily, the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. That was over 50 years ago. The word temporary has never worked a longer shift in its life. What he actually did, in plain clothes and a calm voice, was end the rules money had followed for thousands of years. From that night on, America became the banker in a global game of monopoly. And the one thing every kid learns about the banker is that the banker cannot go broke. Read the rule book. When the bank runs out of money, it just cuts more strips of paper and writes new numbers on them. That is not cheating. That is the official instruction printed right there in the box. After 1971, that became the actual financial system of the entire planet. The strips of paper were dollars, and exactly one country was allowed to hold the scissors. Today the United States government owes more than $36 trillion, and it owes all of it in a currency it can create out of nothing, on demand, whenever it likes. Which sets up a question that quietly breaks people. If you can print the money, why would you ever borrow it? Why is the biggest money printer in history also carrying the biggest debt in history? That is the paradox. We have to go back. Before paper money, before metal money, back to when money was lunch. Picture a world with no money at all, just people, land, and time. People spend their time to get food, and that is the whole economy. In a lot of early societies, rice was not just dinner, it was money. Say it takes you 8 hours to gather 10 cups of rice. If I want to trade you for something, I am going to price it in how many hours of rice gathering it is worth to me. That is the seed of the labor theory of value, the old idea that a thing should be worth the work it took to make it. So having extra rice was not just a full stomach. Extra rice was power, because you could trade it for somebody else's hours. The people sitting on the biggest piles of food slowly started running everything. But rice has a flaw. It rots. It is heavy, and you cannot exactly carry your fortune across a desert. Wealth needed an upgrade, something that lasts and travels. Which brings us to the next kind of money, token money. Pretty much every culture on Earth stumbled onto the same trick at the same time. Rarity makes value. Shells, beads, pretty stones, whatever was hard to get, became treasure. The problem is that a treasure in one village was a handful of garbage in the next one over. For trade between strangers, the world needed one thing everybody, everywhere agreed, was worth something. That is where gold walks in. Rare enough to matter, soft enough to shape. Inflation is a gift to borrowers, but the saver watches his pile rot in real time. The same 10 coins buying half of what they used to. Inflation robs the saver, so the fairest setup is stable prices, where nobody gets quietly mugged in their sleep. There is just one problem with that lovely idea. Societies naturally make more stuff over time. Farming gets better, tools get better, people get cleverer, output keeps climbing. But if the gold supply is basically fixed while the pile of goods keeps growing, you get constant downward pressure on prices, which means constant pain for anyone in debt. So money wants to grow to keep up with the economy, and the most elegant way to grow it is not to dig up more gold. It is to make the money you already have move faster. The best example happened during the brutal deflation of the Great Depression. A small Austrian town called Wargl ran a strange experiment. They made money that was designed to lose value on purpose. Every month you had to buy a little stamp and stick it on your bill to keep it valid, and the stamp cost about 1% of the note. Sit on your money, and it quietly bleeds 1% a month, so nobody sat on it. Everybody spent it the second they got it. The results were almost embarrassing. That little local money changed hands hundreds of times in barely a year, doing the work of a money supply many times its size, putting people to work and getting goods and services moving. That flood of activity, all the work and trade getting done, is what we call gross domestic product, or GDP. It is how we keep score on an economy. Think of GDP as a third tank, one that catches everything flowing through the market in a year. The money tank and the goods tank measure stuff that is just sitting there. The GDP tank measures motion, how much actually got done. And that leads to one of the most quietly important equations ever written. M times V equals P times Q. M is the money supply. V is velocity, how many times each unit of money changes hands in a year. P is the average price of things, and Q is the quantity of things produced. When economists talk about GDP, they are basically talking about P times Q, the total value of everything made and sold. Which means an economy can grow two ways. You can add more money, or you can take the money you have and make it move faster. Wargl just proved you could fake being rich by sprinting. So far the people are running this on their own. Now a much bigger player walks into the room. The government, in the old gold economies, like the first Italian city-states, the government ran a tidy little loop. Spend gold on roads and soldiers and clerks, then tax that same gold back out of the economy. Spend, tax, repeat. Very neat, very boring, right up until somebody attacks you. In 1170, Venice got a nasty surprise when the Byzantine emperor suddenly ordered every Venetian merchant in his empire arrested and seized their ships, warehouses, and goods in one move. Venice needed a war fleet. Fast. We are talking over 100 warships, which cost far more gold than any tax collector could ever scrape together in time. So Venice invented a workaround. Forced loans. Wealthy citizens had to hand gold to the state, and in return they got paper certificates, promising 5% interest a year. One of the earliest government bonds in history, which is a fancy word for a written promise to pay you back later. Here is the clever part. The government immediately spent that gold on ships and soldiers, shoving it right back into the economy, while the paper bonds also started getting traded around like money. So Venice basically doubled its money supply. The same gold that built the fleet was now in workers' pockets, and the bonds claiming that gold were circulating too. And these bonds did something brand new. Their value floated on trust. When Venice was winning, and trade was booming, a bond was as good as gold, 1 for 1. When Venice was losing, and people doubted the state could pay, the price collapsed. At the worst moments people were buying Venetian bonds for about 20 cents on the dollar. The bond market had quietly become a mood ring for the government, a prediction market on whether the state would survive the year. That is the third kind of money being born. Governments invented it, but the free market was about to take it somewhere insane. This is debt money. It started with goldsmiths, of all people. Goldsmiths already had strong vaults, so merchants and rich families started storing their gold with them, and got a paper receipt, promising the gold back on demand. Turns out hauling around heavy gold is a pain, so people just started trading the receipts instead. The paper itself became money. Then the goldsmiths noticed something that would reshape the planet. On any given day, only about 10% of the gold ever got withdrawn. The other 90% just sat in the dark doing nothing. So they thought, why not lend the idle gold out and charge interest? When someone needed a loan, the goldsmith handed over real gold and took a written promise to repay, an IOU. But here is the loop. The borrower almost always walked the gold right back to a vault and deposited it again, because paper was easier to carry. Now zoom out on the whole system. 10 coins come in. The goldsmith keeps 1 in reserve and lends out 9. Those 9 get redeposited. He keeps 10% and lends out 8. Those come back, and on, until you reach the last coin. By the end, 10 real gold coins are quietly holding up 100 coins worth of paper promises. The money supply just multiplied by 10, purely because of that 10% reserve. From that day on, roughly 90% of all the money in the world has been this. Debt money. Money that is really just somebody's promise. The bankers were not done. They looked at the system and asked the dangerous question. If everybody treats our paper as money anyway, why bother lending out the gold at all? So when a customer needed a loan, the banker just printed a fresh banknote, identical to a deposit receipt, and handed it over. The customer handed back a promise to repay. No gold moved an inch. They traded one piece of paper for another piece of paper, and the loan itself created brand new money that did not exist 5 seconds earlier. That is arguably the biggest single shift in the history of money. The power to conjure money out of a promise became the engine of the entire modern world. And of course they kept pushing.
Banks realized they were sitting on yet another kind of money. The IOUs the borrowers had signed. Not the banknotes floating around town, but the private promises locked in the vault. Most people's IOU is worth roughly nothing. But a king's IOU, now that, people figured, was as good as gold. In 1672, London's goldsmith bankers were holding enormous IOUs from King Charles II. These royal promises looked like the safest money on earth. So the bankers made a very confident decision. They used the king's debt as collateral to borrow from other banks and lend even more. That built a tower. The king's IOU backed loans to Bank A. Bank A's loans, backed by royal debt, backed loans to Bank B. Bank B lent to merchants. Merchants funded trade voyages. A giant tower of credit, every floor resting on one man's promise. Then King Charles calmly announced he would stop paying his debts. The whole tower found out at once that the foundation was just a guy who changed his mind. If that sounds familiar, it should. Their customers are freaked out, watching to see how low the market will go. Fast forward to 2008, and the only real difference was the promise at the bottom of the tower. This time, it was not a king. It was millions of mortgage IOUs, bundled, stacked, and sold as if they were as safe as gold. When the bottom floor stopped paying, the world discovered, again, that the entire financial system was a tower of trust standing on a promise. And once again, the government had to walk in and hold it up. This is where the real power grab starts. The Bank of England built a brand new floor above all the other banks. Instead of being just another bank, it became the bank for the banks. A central bank. To join the club, ordinary banks brought their cash and gold to the Bank of England and got reserve credits in return. Just numbers in the central bank's ledger. That is base money, and only the central bank was allowed to make it. Those reserves capped how much each bank could lend, because they had to keep roughly 10% of their loans backed by reserves. And if one bank got into trouble and panicked customers came running for their money, the central bank could step in with emergency cash and stop the panic from spreading. A fire extinguisher for financial fires, held by the one institution that could conjure water from nothing. Then the Bank of England's relationship with the British government revealed the real magic trick hiding inside this whole design. When Napoleon was threatening to erase Britain from the map, the old taxing and saving could not raise money fast enough to fight him. So they did the move. The government issued new bonds. The central bank created new money to buy those bonds, and the government spent that fresh money straight into the war. Strip away the steps, and it is the government printing money and handing it to itself, with a polite paper trail in between, so nobody has to say it out loud. America liked this trick so much, it built its own central bank, the Federal Reserve, in 1913. We just call it the Fed. And the Fed ran this play on a scale nobody had ever seen during both world wars, pumping out money and buying war bonds to arm the country. Here is the part that confuses people. During World War II, the Fed nearly doubled the money supply, and yet prices did not spiral out of control during the war. Why? Because the money had somewhere real to go. Every new dollar was matched by a new tank, a new ship, a new plane rolling off a line. Output exploded right alongside the money, so GDP shot up instead of prices. That is the whole secret. Printing money works when the economy has the muscle to absorb it. The money turns into real things instead of just bidding up the price of the things that already exist. The losers of the war did not get to play this game. They printed money with no production to soak it up, and they paid for it. The ugliest example was Hungary. After the war it was wrecked, and nobody outside Hungary wanted its currency. So to pay foreign debts and import basics it needed US dollars. To get dollars, the government printed bigger and bigger piles of its own money to buy them, which made its own money worth less, which meant it had to print even more. By 1946, this death spiral produced the largest banknote ever made, a 100 quintillion pengo note. That is a 1 with 20 zeros after it. Within days, the entire money supply of the country could not buy a single US cent. The lesson landed hard. Printing only works if your money is wanted, and by the end of the war the most wanted money on earth, by a mile, belonged to the United States. By 1945, America was holding around 60% of all the gold reserves on the planet. It literally had more gold than it had dollars in circulation. The dollar was not just backed by gold, it was overbacked. And America walked into the room, knowing it. In 1944, at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 countries gathered for a conference to redesign world money. Before this, every currency was tied to gold at some rate. After Bretton Woods, only the US dollar was convertible to gold, at $35 an ounce. Every other currency was pegged to the dollar, so gold sat at the top, the dollar sat just under it, as the one currency that could touch gold, and everybody else hung off the dollar. A clean little pyramid, with America one step from the crown. It worked beautifully, as long as America behaved and actually kept the gold. By the 1960s, two things started bending the system. America was spending enormous amounts on the Vietnam War, and on a wave of new social programs at home at the same time, the famous guns and butter era, where the answer to every either-or was both. And underneath that was a deeper trap. The whole world needed more and more dollars to trade and to hold as reserves. But the only way to get dollars out into the world was for America to print and spend more of them than it had gold to back. The more the dollar succeeded as the world's money, the less real gold stood behind each one. By 1971, foreign governments were holding far more dollars than America had gold to redeem, and they could do the math. Countries like France and Japan were not thrilled that America could spend freely while everyone else had to treat dollars like sacred gold and ration them. So they called the bluff. France quietly started cashing in dollars for actual gold, hauling it across the ocean, because they could see how this story ended. The gold drained out of America vault by vault. Then the crack everyone feared showed up in the open market, where the price of physical gold started climbing above the official $35 an ounce. The market was politely announcing that America's promise was mathematically impossible. The gold behind a dollar was now worth more than a dollar. So America had two choices: stop creating dollars to protect the gold link, or rip the gold link out entirely. Nixon picked the scissors. He cut gold out of the pyramid and put America on top, in its place. Which brings us right back to that quiet Sunday night broadcast. And what Nixon did was take an ancient idea, and for the first time, stretch it over the entire planet. Think about tickets at a county fair. Inside the fair, those tickets are as good as cash, because you literally cannot ride the rides or buy the food without them. Walk out the gate, and they are worthless scraps of paper. Their value comes from one thing only: an authority that forces you to use them. That is fiat money. Money that is valuable because someone in charge says so. Fiat had been tried plenty of times in history, but it was always local, one country's fair. Nixon's real innovation was not inventing fiat money. It was turning the whole world into America's fairground. And the Federal Reserve became the gatekeeper, the final authority on money for the entire planet. The Fed's ledger quietly became the world's master ledger, the one place all dollars are ultimately born. Every bank on earth plugs into it, directly or through somebody who does, which leaves us with a world stacked in three tiers. At the very top sits the United States, the only banker who gets to create the world's money. In the middle sit countries that print their own real currency, like the United Kingdom, Japan, or Canada. Money the world will accept, but that is not the global standard. And at the bottom sits everybody else, the countries that do not get to print money the world wants. They have to earn dollars or borrow them, the same way you and I have to earn or borrow money we cannot make ourselves. To feel what each tier really means, let us shrink the whole thing back down to the smallest economy there is: a house. From now on, let us both write down every cent we spend. Think of a family as a tiny economy. Income comes in, expenses go out, and if a household overspends and runs dry, the last resort is credit, handing a bank an IOU in exchange for money. Now, there is one rule that quietly decides everything. If the interest on that debt grows faster than the family's income, the debt snowballs, the payments swallow the paychecks, and eventually it ends in default and the loss of everything. That family cannot print money to escape, so the math is the boss. And here is the uncomfortable part: most things wearing a suit and calling themselves a government live by that exact same rule. A city, a state, a town. They do not print their own currency, so they have to balance the books or break. No different from the household. It even traps whole countries that gave up the printer. When Greece joined the euro, it handed its money-making power to a central bank it did not control. So when Greece needed money, it could not print. It had to go borrow it from the market by selling bonds, which drags us into the one idea you actually need to understand all of this: bond yield. Say Greece sells a 100 euro bond, promising 3 euros of interest a year, and it sells at face value, 100 euros. That is a 3% yield, because the yield is just the yearly interest divided by what you paid. Now imagine investors get scared, and the bond's price drops to 50 euros on the open market. The government is still only paying 3 euros a year, but 3 euros on a 50 euro purchase is 6%. The yield doubled, and nobody changed the bond. The market did. So the yield is really a confidence meter. Low yield means the market trusts you. High yield means the market thinks you might not pay. In Greece, the fear fed on itself, and the selling did not stop until Greek bond yields blew past 35%. And that number is not just a vibe, it sets the price of all future borrowing. Greece would have had to promise more than 35% interest to borrow anything new, which is another way of saying it was over. The government defaulted and paid bondholders a fraction of what they were owed. Now climb up a tier to countries that do print their own money, like Britain or Japan. When they run out, they have a door the household, and Greece never had. They can create new money and buy their own bonds. The same trick the Bank of England pulled against Napoleon. But there is a catch, and it is the whole game. An economy can only swallow so much new money before it chokes, and the size of that throat is GDP. Push in more money than the economy can turn into real goods, and the extra just bids up prices. That is inflation. Which gives us a neat little rule. A country's bond yield roughly equals its expected growth, plus its expected inflation, because lenders want enough interest to cover what the economy is creating, and to cover the value inflation will quietly eat. So a country growing at 2%, with 5% expected inflation, will see its yields drift towards 7%. And notice the twist. The government gets to set the bond's starting price, but the market sets the yield, and the market does not take orders. You can print the money, you cannot print the trust. Which finally brings us to the top of the pyramid. The United States. The dollar is not just America's money. It is the world's reserve currency, sitting on one side of nearly 90% of all currency trades, and making up around 60% of the reserves other central banks hold. That global job hands America a cushion against inflation that nobody else gets. When America prints new dollars, they do not just slosh around inside America. They pour out into the whole world through trade and investment and everyone else's reserve. Since the entire planet is hungry for dollars, America can create far more of them before prices catch fire, because the pressure is spread across every economy on Earth. That is what lets America borrow on a scale that would flatten any other country. It does that borrowing by selling treasury bonds, and those bonds became the bedrock of all of global finance, the thing the world treats as the closest thing to risk-free. Every other interest rate on the planet stacks on top of the treasury yield. Other governments pay more than US treasuries. Companies pay more than governments. And your car loan and your mortgage pay more than the companies. When the treasury yield moves up just 1%, it ripples out into roughly $3 trillion of extra borrowing costs around the world. So those are not really America's interest rates. They are the world's interest rates, set in one building. And the survival of this whole arrangement comes down to one quiet comparison: growth versus interest. As long as the economy grows faster than the interest on the debt stays manageable, because the country is outrunning its own bill. But the moment interest climbs above growth, the debt payments start eating a bigger and bigger slice of everything the country produces, and the math begins to turn against it. That single race, growth against yield, is the real scoreboard for American power. And there are exactly two ways it can break. The first is too many dollars. Flood the world with more than even the global economy can absorb, and investors get nervous about inflation and demand higher yields to protect themselves, which pushes the whole system toward that dangerous line. The second way is scarier and more deliberate. When foreign countries earn dollars, they do not stuff them in a mattress. They buy US Treasury bonds to earn interest and shelter from inflation, which means the biggest holders of America's debt are other countries: China, Japan, the oil producers. Economists have a name for this: the balance of terror. If those giant holders ever agreed to dump their treasuries all at once, yields would spike across the entire planet overnight, jacking up debt payments not just for America, but for every government, business and homeowner with a loan anywhere. That is why dumping treasuries is called the financial nuclear option. The catch is that pulling the trigger torches the value of your own pile on the way down, which is the only reason it has not happened, and yet the system just keeps going. Here is the part that flips your whole intuition. When the US government spends more than it taxes and runs a deficit, that missing money does not vanish. It lands in the private side of the economy, as dollars in the accounts of citizens and companies. The government's debt is somebody else's savings. So yes, the government's column shows $36 trillion of debt, but flip the page, and America's total assets run well over $150 trillion. That is a big reason the market stays calm while the headline number looks terrifying. The debt is only half of a ledger people keep reading as a suicide note. So in the end, America has exactly one real limit, and it is not a number in Washington. It is the productive capacity of the entire world. Pour out so many dollars that even the global economy cannot turn them into real things, and you finally get worldwide inflation. That is the true ceiling on this kind of power, and nobody is sure where it is. Nixon's quiet Sunday broadcast in 1971 finished the job money had been heading toward for centuries. It cut money loose from anything you can hold. Today's dollar is not backed by gold or silver or anything in a vault. It is backed by the strength of the economy using it, and by our shared bet that tomorrow will be fine. The real reserve currency was never the dollar. It is belief. And the honest truth is that nobody knows how far you can stretch that belief before it snaps. Especially when you are the world's reserve currency, there is no line painted on the floor. And you really do not want to go looking for exactly where it is, because the way you find it is by crossing it, and by then it is already over. Thanks for watching. If you want to be there for the next one, before the belief runs out, stick around and subscribe. There is something coming I think you are going to like.